So I'm Astrid Nilsson Lewis, and I'm a climate inequality policy advisor at Oxfam Sweden. And just quickly on Oxfam, in case you're not, I think a lot of you are from the UK, I hear, so you should maybe know Oxfam, but Oxfam is a global organization that works in over 80 countries to save and improve people's lives for an equal future. Oxfam fights injustices that cause poverty and oppression and are present in times of crisis and disaster. So in addition to our humanitarian work, we contribute with new knowledge, make skewed social structures visible, and give people tools for change, as well as demanding that people in power take responsibility. Our overarching goal is an equal world that is fair and sustainable, where people and the planet are respected in a fair economic system. And of course, climate impacts all those goals. So climate has become a bigger topic at Oxfam. And so I'm going to talk to you about climate inequality today. We usually speak about 3 dimensions of climate inequality: the emissions, the impacts, and the responsibility. So I will go through them one by one. The first dimension is emissions inequality. And we talk a lot about differences between countries, with rich industrialized countries, of course, carrying most of the responsibility due to historical emissions. But what we have shown, together with Stockholm Environment Institute, and you will hear from Emily from SCI that we have worked closely with, but there is also large inequality differences between income groups. And you probably have heard these statistics already, and Andrew just brought some up. But what we find is that the richest 1% were responsible for 16% of global consumption-based emissions in 2019. And that's the same amount as 2/3 of the world's population. The richest 10% account for half of global emissions. And since 1990, the richest 1% have used up twice as much carbon budget as the poorest half of humanity. One way to visualize this is this graph that you may have seen. We call it the champagne glass, and it makes this skewed emission distribution really clear, where you see that the poorest people in the world, the bottom 50%, only emitted 8% of emissions in 2019, versus the top emitters on top have a big share, with the 10% richest responsible for 50% of emissions. And important to mention here is that this is only looking at income. We're not able to include wealth, which means that the inequality in reality is even more extreme than this. And just one more way to look at these emissions is that is this graph that looks at per capita emissions, so yearly emissions per person. And this 2.8 line that you can see in the bottom is a measure of a sustainable level of emissions, where we need to be at in 2030. There's different ways to calculate that, but it gives you an idea of which level we should be aiming for in just a couple of years, and that the bottom 50% are under that line, the middle 40 are close to it, but all the other income groups are way above it. And the richest 0.1%, which is the group that we're maybe most interested in today, is really far above. So in 2019, they emitted 77 times more than that threshold. And the scenarios to 2030 show that we're not going to get close to reducing their emissions to the level that is needed. And I mean, basically, it means that we're using our carbon budget to fuel the overconsumption of the ultra rich, to fuel luxury emissions instead of fighting climate crisis and supporting people to get out of poverty. And just to mention the absolute extreme emissions on the top, the transport emissions are highly unequal. We know that only 2 to 4% of the world's population flies internationally, and only 1% of the population accounts for half of all aviation emissions in the world. And Oxfam looked at the world's richest 50 people in the world and found data for 23 of them when it comes to their private jets. And on average, these billionaires each took 184 flights, spending 425 hours in the air over a 1-year period. And these emissions corresponds to 300 years of emissions of an average person in the world. And interesting here is that it's becoming more and more challenging to do these kinds of studies because these ultra-rich people are don't want to be tracked, don't want to be seen, and so more and more they're renting instead of having their own private jets so that they can avoid being tracked. So it shows that there is increasing pressure, but also that they're finding ways to continue. And we often talk about private jets, but actually yachts are even worse. The amounts of super yachts have doubled since 2000. And the yachts are way worse than private jets. They emit about 3 times more than private jets. This is again from the same analysis from Oxfam of the 50 richest people in the world. And what we see is that on average, their yachts' emissions of 1 year emitted as much as 860 years of average person's emissions. So that's there's an illustration of the emissions inequality. The second dimension is the consequences. And of course, we know that different regions in the world will be affected differently by climate change. But generally, poorer countries also depend more on sectors that are more vulnerable to climate change, such as agriculture, which means that hit with the same effect, you could say, the effect will be higher in poorer countries in terms of crop loss and impacts on the population. We've calculated that 78% of excess death due to heat will happen in low and lower middle income countries. But even within countries, we see that, of course, the climate crisis hit the hardest those that are already most vulnerable. And this is because they have less capacity to prepare and less capacity to recover. This illustration is really telling because you can see 2 neighborhoods next to each other in a city in India, which is where the slum area is up to 6 degrees warmer during a heat wave compared to the neighborhoods just next to it that is much greener. And of course, then talking about the polluter elite in terms of consequences, while the poorest cannot prepare and adapt, we have the ultra-rich that are preparing their escape. You probably heard the same news about buying bunkers and securing passports to New Zealand, or even Elon Musk floating the idea of evacuating Earth for Mars. So these are really the 2 extremes, of course, of the scale. But what we see basically is that we have a vicious circle between inequality and climate breakdown, where the emissions of the richest fuel a crisis that impacts the most vulnerable. And there are many effects to this. More unequal societies are more polarized. There's higher beliefs in conspiracy theories. It undermines democracy, which is really important if we're going to find the consensus that we need to fight the climate crisis. It also creates really bad consumption norms, and we know that in more unequal countries, people take higher debts to match these consumption norms. So there is a lot of effects that are beyond just the emissions of having high inequalities, and these effects are making it harder to fight the climate crisis. But moving then to the third dimension, capacity and responsibility, we also know that because the ultra-rich have these excessive luxury emissions, these emissions are both morally unacceptable, but they're also low-hanging fruits in terms of emission reductions. Just stop with the private jets and the yachts. We don't need those emissions when we're fighting a burning crisis. And as well, they have also high responsibility and often power in our economic and political system, much more than like average citizens. They often run, invest, profit from corporations that fuel carbon emissions. And this is actually the topic of a report that's coming out just in a few weeks from Oxfam. So I cannot really reveal anything, but it's a lot of things you already know. I mean, put simply, when there's a lot of wealth concentration on top, it gives excessive power. And I think Elon Musk is the perfect example of this lately with, someone unelected suddenly in the White House. When you are very rich, you have higher power on the economy and on politics. you control corporations that have a central role in the transition, either because you're a shareholder or because you're a CEO. You also invest your money in ways that have impacts on the transition. We've looked at the investments of 125 of the world's richest billionaires, and we've seen that on average they emit 3 million tons a year based on their investments, and that they tend to invest much more in fossil fuels and industry than cement, like very high polluting industries, in comparison to an average investment portfolio. Of course, there is the lobbying and the media control. Here I showed you put a Guardian article on COP billionaires. There's more and more billionaires going to COP, and often they have made fortunes on polluting industries. There's many famous examples like the Koch brothers, which built their fortune on fossil industries that have had really big influence on American politics, but also politics worldwide, and through this Atlas network, which is a network of ultra-conservative think tanks. So we see here that it is a very organized machine to try to delay climate action and spread disinformation. The last point is the media. For example, we have fracking billionaires Barris and Dan Wilkes have donated millions to right-wing media organization that promotes climate change denialism. In France, we have billionaires that invest in bolstering the far right, buying up and impacting media channels like C News. It's a big media channel that became a little bit rebranded as the French Fox News, and the channel was fined for broadcasting climate disinformation. And to make the connection with the tech billionaires, again, Elon Musk controlling X is very worrying. It is a platform. It's where we receive a lot of our information, and information here is really central in the climate crisis. I read today that TikTok is about to be bought up by investors and billionaire Larry Ellison. And again, do we want our different news channels to be controlled by the ultra rich? I think this is really worrying. Right, and so just to wrap up, this going back to the picture that we paint at Oxfam, is that we see that, of course, rich industrialized countries have high responsibility and great capacity to transition, and thus needs to do it first quickly and support countries in their transitions. And that's what we say in the Paris Agreement. But similarly, the rich have a great responsibility and capacity to transition. They have unnecessary emissions that are low-hanging fruits and that we must address. Vulnerable countries and people have less capacity to prepare and recover, and they need support. Simply put, we need to flip this vicious circle around, and we really think that if we work with reducing inequality, we can also find new ways, new levers to fight the climate crisis. Thank you so much for listening. I hope I didn't go over time.